I have one more question from the online audience that I just want to pose because I think it's something we haven't really talked a lot about yet. And the question's from Danny in California. Are for-profit colleges raising tuition to get around the 90-10 rule? And if so, is this legal? Perhaps first we might want to explain what the 90-10 rule is.
The 90-10 rule is supposed to be a cash flow analysis that limits the percentage of your total revenues that may come from Title IV federal financial aid programs to 90 cents on the dollar. So to be eligible to participate in the Department of Education's federal student aid program, no more than 90 cents on the dollar of your actual revenues may come from those programs. Important to understand, it doesn't say you should have a single greenback of real privately earned money in your cash flow. 90 cents on the dollar can come from Title IV, and the other 10 cents could be VA benefits, it could be DOD tuition assistance program, it could be state subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. So you can still be a total creature of public subsidies and pass the 90-10 rule. Are they increasing tuition in response to it? And the short answer appears to be yes. They are doing it through some really creative financial engineering activities which involve, because technically, I mean, you could very simply jack up tuition and then give everybody 10 cents worth of institutional grant discount. Well, that doesn't count because that doesn't reflect itself in any cash flows. So one of the more creative ways in which they're doing it is they seem to be partnering with outside lenders who are providing supposedly private label lending for the 10 cents for the additional tuition money that is being supposedly coming in from the 10 cent side, except one little detail is that in some instances we see institutional credit enhancement. In other words, the institution is knowingly, basically guaranteeing the paper. So the short answer to that question is yes, but with the twist that they have to engage in some really creative financial engineering to make it workable.
Right. And the second part of the question was, if so, is this legal? And I think the implication of your answer is yes, it is legal. As you
Everything
mentioned
we've
before,
told you is legal because they wrote the law.
Actually, I would like to weigh in on that really briefly. Not everything is legal, actually. When I was working there and I found out through reading that it is legal to pay recruiters solely based on your sales numbers, I was shocked because that's exactly what they did, and they made no effort to make it seem like it was anything else. You were told the day you were hired that if you make your sales numbers and you sit a lot of students in class, you're going to make a lot of money. If you don't make your goal, you'll be gone in 6 months. They keep scoreboards on the floor by your team about how many applications you've taken that week, and you get awards, you get taken out to lunch. There is no other metric in what goes into your salary.
Going back to this question of legality, creative accounting methods always sort of are ahead of the regulation, right? And so 5 years later, we decided, you know what, this was illegal, the whole Enron business. It was creative accounting that we now think is legal, but there's always this lag between regulation and what is actually going. So we see creative accounting mechanisms that we might later decide are legal, but at this time they're not.
Well, one of the things that we've seen across history, I mentioned at the beginning, that the for-profit sector is not new. There are elements of it that are new, and it's certainly more visible now than it's been. But we've seen this interaction between policy and regulation and the for-profit sector basically since World War II, when we had the first government interventions and through the GI Bill about providing government money to help students go to college. And you had, at that time, you had these what were called fly-by-night institutions that would come forward in order to justify it. Regulation came from that in order to try to clamp down on that, to try to understand what is a real institution of higher education before it's eligible. And that's really why we have a system of accreditation today that is the gatekeeper for access to financial aid, because at that time there was no gatekeeper associated with it. And so the federal government decided that accreditation would end up being that gatekeeper. Then you had different sorts of accreditation agencies being founded. Institutions do different sorts of things to work through the regulations and figure them out. You have ups and downs in the sector where in response to regulation, some schools close, some schools merge. You have a decline in enrollment. And then the ones that are left are facing a market that opens up for them. They have less competition and they're able to expand and grow and develop other sorts of strategies of making money. And we see this repeatedly throughout history of different ways that the interaction between the policy regime and the for-profit sector, indeed higher education as a whole, but the for-profit sector in particular, has reacted to them.
It's definitely cyclical. And Andrew, I wanted to just note that is it Andrew Rosen? Yeah, the chief officer at Kaplan said he has a new book called Change.edu, and he said the temptation to exploit or the temptation to engage in these ills is inherent in our field, right? And this is someone who runs a for-profit industry, a for-profit institution who's admitting this. And so we're always going to have this ongoing challenge to manage these ills that we understand are inherent in a for-profit context that we might not see in a nonprofit context.
And I think the final thing, we've been talking specifically about for-profit and a little bit of connection to the rest of higher education. One of the real difficult things in regulating higher education is figuring out whether one-size-fits-all policies are actually appropriate. It's an incredibly diverse system. It's not just you have public sector, nonprofit, and for-profit, but you also have everything from PhD granting research universities to non-degree technical welding schools, and they all fit under the same sort of regulatory framework. And there aren't very many places where we can legitimately disentangle these different kinds of elements in order to target different sorts of regulations. One of the challenges that we have in thinking through solutions to this is a solution that might be appropriate for-profit institutions would certainly not be appropriate for a public sector institution, or would arguably, I guess, be inappropriate for a public sector institution. And so you have to figure out how these kinds of things go together and making sure you deal with that. I think we're getting close to wrapping up, so maybe I'll just have a couple of words here. It's clear that passions are high around this, particularly for people who've had particular personal experiences with them. And of course, there is an alternative explanation and discussion with this that we did not present here. We did not present any sort of pro-for-profit argument very explicitly in here. But of course, there are other points of view and other perspectives, and I encourage people to seek those out to see other points of view on this. There's a diversity in the for-profit sector as well as in other elements, both within institutions and between institutions, and that not all institutions exhibit the same characteristics that we're talking about here. So I think that's important as well. And I think the final thing is going back to a point I made before, and that Barmak echoed, the idea that the for-profit sector has some necessity to it, at least in the way that we formulated it right now. If we are to imagine a scenario where we are getting rid of for-profit higher education, or we imagine a scenario where profit does not have a role in education, we really have to think about how that transforms the education system that we have here. We developed a system in this country about 40 or 50 years ago that presumed the private sector was going to have a role and that the government could fund students and support students to make independent choices no matter where they went. If we want to rethink that 40-year-old agreement, it would cause a significant amount of disruption, and we'd really have to think through how those things work. So there are no simple answers or easy solutions, and anyone who says that, well, we should get rid of for-profits right off the bat hasn't been thinking clearly about what the real policy issues and difficulties would be for doing that. I think the final point is I'm supposed to let you know that the website forprofitu.org will have at least portions of this webinar available in the next few days online. And so if you want to follow up with any of that online, there's those information. And I think information about the panelists will be available as well if anyone would like to follow up with any of us as well. So with that, I thank you all for your participation and your engagement with us, and particularly like to thank the panel for an enlightening and engaging discussion. I've learned a lot, and I've appreciated getting to know you all tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.